Subcommittee on National Security will come to order. Without objection, the presiding member of the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Over the course of the last 2.5 weeks, we've heard news accounts of a wave of foreign nationals headed for the U.S. southern border. We're here today to discuss the impending arrival of what was initially called an immigrant caravan, which remains a challenge of U.S. border security. The San Diego-based group Pueblos Sin Fronteras, or People Without Borders, has taken credit for organizing the effort. While they claim to provide humanitarian aid to migrants and refugees, what they are doing now is undermining the rule of law. For 10 years now, this group has escorted foreign nationals on an annual trek from Central America through Mexico, encouraging many to continue to the United States to take advantage of asylum laws. This year, they drew their biggest crowd yet, more than 1,200 people. And in some ways, there are similarities to what we experienced in 2014, when waves of unaccompanied minors and young mothers with children streamed across the border. Unlike his predecessor, President Trump called out the Mexican government's failure to step up and do their part to accommodate these refugees. For far too long, Mexico has been derelict in its duty. For far too long, Mexico has been content to let these caravans pass on through and become our problem. Not anymore. Coincidentally, a few days after this group decided to begin its annual march, DHS released its monthly apprehension statistics, which showed an alarming resurgence of illegal border crossers. What we saw in response was the consistency of conviction of President Trump's administration, of course, who campaigned on building a wall and who backs the brave men and women of ICE and Border Patrol and law enforcement everywhere who are working hard. It took courage to mobilize the National Guard without manufacturing a humanitarian crisis like the previous administration. As Commander-in-Chief, the President has every right to take meaningful measures to protect our way of life, maintain the integrity of our borders, and safeguard our immigration system. We all know the National Guard cannot serve in this capacity indefinitely. We need to take a hard look at what our existing laws and capabilities are and be honest about what can actually be done to not only enhance border security, but to reduce the magnet of illegal immigration going forward. The caravan had the unintended consequence of helping the Trump administration identify its operational and legal vulnerabilities and provided us with an opportunity to conduct much-needed oversight of some key immigration loopholes. Reminds us of how porous our borders still are, with people and drugs being smuggled in daily. We also see how, by directing our finite resources to illicit activity in one direction, we may be leaving a gaping hole for cartels and gangs to pass through in another. Now, there are promising actions that can be taken to get a handle on this. The Trump administration should follow the President's first immigration executive order and properly interpret the Wilberforce Act. In addition, to combat the abuse of asylum laws, both the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice should send asylum officers directly to the border for a rocket docket to immediately hold a rapid-fire field hearing and conclude that folks trying to abuse the asylum laws are in fact ineligible, and then allowing them to be placed in expedited deportation. What is more, both Article 2 of the Constitution and the delegated authority given to the President by the Congress to keep anyone who has not already entered and even override refugee and asylum policies when he determines it's against our interests. That's in the law now. When you have criminals, gangsters, a drug crisis, and the political nature of the mass illegal immigration, this clearly fits that description. And finally, Congress, as part of any effort to tighten immigration statutes, must limit at least the power of the lower courts to block expedited deportation or denial of entry, except when there is a prima facie claim of a plaintiff being a U.S. citizen. We have a lot of work yet to do, and I'm glad to introduce our distinguished panel of experts who are here to help shed light on this important issue. Mr. Brandon Judd is here to speak on behalf of the approximately 15,000 Border Patrol agents in his capacity as the President of the National Border Patrol Council. Colonel Stephen McCraw currently serves as the Director of the Texas Department of Public Safety, which oversees 13 state criminal justice and public safety divisions. We also have the Honorable Art Arthur, a resident fellow with the Center for Immigration Studies and former immigration judge. And lastly, we welcome Mr. Michael Bream from the Truman Center, a national security expert and Iraq War veteran. I'd like to add that we did invite the U.S. Border Patrol to join us here today, and they chose not to send a witness to testify on this important matter. Again, I'd like to thank all the witnesses who decided to join us today and look forward to their testimony. Finally, I just want to make sure we will be maintaining order in the hearing room. So I thank you, and I yield to my ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank and welcome our witnesses today. Thank you all for helping this committee with its work. As evidenced by the bipartisan omnibus appropriation bill passed last month, there are members on both sides of the aisle who share a commitment to providing our border security and enforcement personnel with the resources necessary to perform their critical missions on behalf of the American people. This agreement, which I supported, I voted for, provides a total of $14 billion for Customs and Border Protection, including $4.4 billion for CBP, Customs and Border Patrol and security operations, and $3.7 billion for U.S. Border Patrol training, development, assets, and other activities. It also makes funding available for the hiring of 351 new Border Patrol agents and law enforcement officers. Now, while the omnibus agreement was a result of hard-fought negotiation and is not a perfect bill, I believe that it does represent a meaningful step towards enhancing our border security. However, it is imperative that the Federal Government utilizes these and other new funding sources provided by the agreement in a wise fashion. In the interest of national security, policies designed to secure our borders against the threat of terrorism, criminal networks, and other illicit activities cannot be based on misinformation or derived from arbitrary presidential tweets. Rather, the strength of our border security framework is dependent on policies developed through bipartisan consideration and grounded entirely in fact. To this end, they must also be undertaken in a manner that avoids demonization and affords maximum respect to the fundamental principles of America as a nation of immigrants, and also adheres to the 1951 Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugees. In view of all these considerations, it's important to review President Trump's recent decision to order deployment of up to 4,000 National Guard personnel to the U.S.-Mexican border. Clearly, this decision is not unprecedented. Both President George W. Bush and President Obama previously invoked so-called Title 32 authority to temporarily deploy thousands of National Guard units to the southwest border to provide technical, logistical, and administrative support to the U.S. Border Control. It is noteworthy that while the U.S. Border Patrol apprehensions for illegal border crossings exceeded 1 million apprehensions in 2006 and over 460,000 apprehensions in 2010, U.S. and Customs and Border Protection reports that in 2017, the agency recorded, quote, the lowest level of illegal cross-border migration on record, as measured by apprehensions and inadmissible encounters at U.S. ports of entry, close quote. The approximate 310,000 arrests for illegal border crossings recorded for 2017 represents the lowest annual apprehension figure since 1971, 46 years ago. In articulating his plan to employ National Guard units, the President has stated, quote, we're looking for from 2,000 to 4,000 and will probably keep them or a large portion of them until such time as we get the wall, close quote. Given that Congress has not authorized funding for the entirety of the President's desired border wall, and absent further clarification of the President's tweet, the deployment of our National Guard units to the southwest border appears to be indefinite in duration at this point. It also remains largely undefined in terms of scope and cost. According to the Independent Government Accountability Office, the collective costs of the two previous National Guard border operations under President Bush and President Obama exceeded $1.35 billion. It's important, I think, for Congress to learn which priorities or programs the military will need to reduce in order to reprogram the necessary funding to pay for this border operation. In order for this committee to examine the merits of the President's action, Today, Ranking Member Cummings and I joined ranking members from the House Homeland Security, Armed Services, and Judiciary Committees in requesting a series of documents from the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security pertaining to the rationale behind the announcement of deploying National Guard troops to the border, as well as the specific activities, durations, and costs associated with this operation. This includes any memoranda of understanding that the administration has negotiated with relevant states and the National Guard Bureau. Along these lines, it would have been very helpful for us to hear from the Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security witnesses at today's hearing as we continue to conduct oversight over our border security policies and seek to identify common sense steps that we can take to better secure our borders in a balanced and sustainable way. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to discussing these issues with our witnesses, and I yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman yields back. I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses. We have Mr. Brandon Judd, President of the National Border Patrol Council, Colonel Stephen McCraw, Director of the Texas Department of Public Safety, the Honorable Art Arthur, Resident Fellow in Law and Policy at the Center for Immigration Studies, and Mr. Michael Breen, President and CEO of the Truman Center. As you can see, there is an empty chair for the uninvited witness, Ms. Carla Provost, Acting Chief at the U.S. Border Patrol, should she choose to attend the hearing. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so if you could all please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. All witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. As a reminder, the clock in front of you shows the remaining time during your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds left and red when your time is up. Please also remember to press the button to turn your microphone on before speaking. And with that, we'll recognize Mr. Judd for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I want to discuss with you the issues of border security and the magnets that draw people to cross our border illegally. This includes, but is not limited to, the catch and release program, manpower, and the use of agents. The catch and release policy is a term that was coined by Border Patrol agents many years ago. It refers to persons arrested for crossing the border illegally and subsequently released into the United States on their own recognizance and prior to having their deportation proceedings adjudicated by an immigration judge. Under this program, most individuals are released with the promise to appear before a judge at a later date that is to be determined. Due to an extensive backlog of cases, the date is usually at least 2 years from the time of release. But it might as well be 10, 15, or 20 years because the vast majority of these individuals never appear before a judge as ordered. Instead, they disappear into the shadows of society. On January 25, 2017, President Donald Trump signed the Border Security and Immigration Improvement Executive Order. Its intent was to implement new policies designed to stem illegal immigration. In support, DHS Secretary John Kelly issued implementation directions via memoranda to all corresponding department heads stating the catch and release policy shall end immediately. Notwithstanding the clear guidance, catch and release policies have not ended. In November of 2017, the field office directors for both San Antonio and El Paso, Texas ICE ERO field offices, sent email messages to Border Patrol leadership stating in part, I have directed my staff to not accept files or custody of any FAMUs, family member units, that are not processed as NTAs, notices to appears, that are not FRC eligible. FRC is Field Relocation Center. My position may change subsequent to discussions with HQ, but for now, ERO San Antonio and El Paso position is that we will not process cases like male HOH, head of household, unless we accept custody, as the transfer of cases is not automatic. By processing illegal border crossers with WANTAs, we consciously continued the catch and release program and sent a clear message to criminal cartels that we are not serious about following through with the President's or Secretary's orders. Criminal cartels continue to exploit our policies, specifically catch and release. They force large groups of people to cross the border illegally in dangerous locations instead of through ports of entry, a controlled environment, in an effort to create gaps in our coverage. By creating gaps, criminal cartels are able to cross higher value contraband such as opioids, criminal aliens, persons from special interest countries, and other narcotics without detection, apprehension, or seizure. By continuing policies like catch and release, we are putting innocent people, like women and children, into the hands of dangerous criminal enterprises. The single biggest challenge that we face right now to securing our border is manpower, as we are currently 2,000 agents below our congressionally mandated floor of 21,370 agents. There are currently 3 challenges that we face: retention, recruitment, and the use of agents. The National Border Patrol Council also views the reinstatement of FLSA as a top priority and one that will significantly improve our urgent retention crisis. I want to be clear about this. Until we address these issues, we will not be able to secure the border. Along with catch and release and manpower, the deployment of our limited resources is an important piece of the border security puzzle. The Washington Times recently published an article highlighting gross mismanagement of the Border Patrol workforce in the McAllen Border Patrol Station. A little more than 700 agents are assigned to the station, and when annual leave, sick leave, and days off duty are calculated, there are approximately 400 agents that show up to work on any given day. Of those 400 agents on duty, only around 50 are deployed to the border. That's unacceptable. This is well below par for a station that controls approximately 60 miles of the border and is the busiest station in the country. The federal government's decision to devote only 12% of the workforce to perform the duties they were hired to perform is lost on me. But for the sake of border security, this is entirely unjustifiable. If you are angry about this, you should be. Protecting our borders is paramount to ensuring homeland security, economic prosperity, and national sovereignty. It is my hope that the members of this committee recognize this and exercise their oversight responsibility to hold Border Patrol management accountable. I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you. Colonel, you're up.
Yeah, Chairman, distinguished members, Stephen Craw, Director of Texas Department of Public Safety. You have my written testimony, so we'll not go into anything that I discussed in there, but 4 things I would like to mention. First, I mean, obviously, the Texas-Mexico border is unsecure. Because of that, the consequence of that is a public safety and national security threat, not just to Texas, but to every community in the United States. And like Ranking Member Lynch, you noted some of those things in your comments along that. Everyone is concerned about the impact of criminal organizations in their communities. And we all recognize that. We're concerned about fentanyl. We're concerned about methamphetamine. If you've got a drug problem, you have a cartel problem. You've got an unsecured border problem. If you have a MS-13 problem in New York, you have a border problem. So clearly, it's the most significant vulnerability that we face right now from a national security and public safety standpoint. From a Texas standpoint, you know, we recognize that it's a sovereign responsibility view of the federal government to secure the border, but when it doesn't happen, it impacts our communities. And Governor Abbott and the state legislature in Texas is not going to sit around and do nothing. And what they have done is they've allocated billions of dollars to support and provide direct support to the U.S. Border Patrol, not compete, complement, and provide direct support to deter, detect, and interdict smuggling incidents between the ports of entry. And that includes Marine assets, a tactical Marine unit we put in place. I've got over 1,000 troopers right now engaged in border security activities. We have 13 aircraft, including 9 helicopters and 4 airplanes that are dedicated full-time to border security operations. We've got 13 tactical boats that are done. We've got 42 Texas Rangers that we've established to address public corruption, but also to work on occasion. And prior, we had to work assault on federal officers because they weren't being handled at the federal level. They are now, thanks to the new U.S. Attorney in the Southern District. But those are the types of things that are important to Texans. And as Texas goes, so goes the nation. And we recognize that also that not only is it a sovereign responsibility of the federal government, it can be done. This is not rocket science. And Mr. Judd mentioned a few of those things that are clearly would enhance or secure the border, without question. And some of those things is people, technology, infrastructure. and the equipment that they need, the resources that they need. And there's no question that they could do it if they had that. But because they don't have it, the Department of Public Safety, the state of Texas, Governor Abbott, they're dedicating resources and time and energy to be able to complement what they're doing in the Border Patrol. I will say this, though, we do appreciate the Texas Military Forces and Texas National Guard in Texas. They do a great job. And in fact, we've had them involved in border security operations from the beginning. We'll continue to do, and thankfully, recently, they've been able to plus up. They bring with them not just the UH-72s, but also other resources that we can use in terms of observation, listening posts. And I can defer to Mr. Judd and how important those things are to be able to deny cartels access to those key areas. And I'm sure I've outlived my time, so I'll stop for right now and move on. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Arthur for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for...
Make sure your mic's on.
I should know that,
There you
shouldn't I?
go.
A caravan organized by an immigrants' rights group in the middle of March 2018 in Tapachula had grown to more than 1,000 people, mostly Honduran nationals, by the end of the month. This was the 8th year such a caravan had been assembled, but the most notable because of a large number of participants. This year's caravan, however, illustrates a little-noticed issue along the southwest border, and that is a sharp increase in the number of alien apprehensions and inadmissibles, reversing a downward trend that had begun in November 2016. From 66,712 in October 2016, the number of aliens entering illegally or seeking entry without proper documents along the southwest border had dropped to 15,780 by April 2017. The numbers, however, began to slowly increase between the spring and early winter of 2017 before declining into the mid-30,000s. In March 2018, with Congress having debated amnesty for DACA applicants and others, however, those numbers skyrocketed to 50,308 apprehended and inadmissible aliens. If this continues, that would be 600,000 aliens in a year. This increase in the phenomenon of the caravan in particular brought into focus some crucial loopholes and flaws in U.S. immigration law. The first is credible fear. In 1996, Congress amended the immigration law to expedite the removal of aliens coming without visas or entering illegally. These amendments, however, included a provision to allow aliens fleeing harm to avoid expedited removal by asserting a credible fear of persecution, allowing them to apply for asylum. In FY 2009, the Asylum Office completed 5,523 credible fear cases. By FY 2013, as news spread that aliens applying for credible fear were being released from custody, that number increased to 33,283. At its height in FY 2016, there were 81,864 credible fear cases. These are people arrested at the border, claim credible fear to get into the United States. The majority of aliens, up to 90% who apply, are found to have credible fear. There are many reasons for this, including a lack of clear guidance in adjudicating asylum claims, the low credible fear standard, and lacks evidentiary burdens to make such a claim. The fact is, most of the aliens in the caravan, should they come to the United States and claim credible fear, would likely be released to await an asylum hearing that may be years in the future, if they appear at all. This is not the only flaw in our immigration laws, however, that renders our borders insecure. Interpretations of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act 2008, or TVPRA, have resulted in the release from removal of tens of thousands of minors from countries other than Mexico, or as we call them, OTMs, including many, if not most of whom, were never trafficked to begin with. This has provided incentives for thousands of other OTM alien minors and their parents to trust those minors' lives to smugglers and undertake the perilous journey to the United States. Similarly, a 20-year-old settlement agreement in Flores versus Reno has created a presumption that alien minors who are apprehended along the border, even those who came with their parents, should be released into the interior of the United States. This provides even greater incentives for illegal entry and more money for the smugglers and cartels who facilitate such entry. Finally, a 2008 expansion of eligibility for special immigrant juvenile visas has provided a third incentive for alien minors to enter the United States illegally, and for their parents to entrust their children to smugglers, debased criminals who deal in human misery. The fact is, most of the OTM alien minors in the caravan will likely be processed and released into the United States if they decide to come here. The administration has taken steps to stem the recent flow of illegal aliens to the United States, including ending catch and release, as we discussed earlier, sending National Guard troops to the border, and establishing a zero-tolerance policy for illegal entry prosecutions. Each of these efforts, however, will fail to secure the border as long as the loopholes and flaws that I have described exist. I want to thank each of you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Breen, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The situation at our southern border represents a foreign policy problem, a drug policy problem, an immigration policy problem, a series of legal problems, a humanitarian problem, a law enforcement problem, and much else besides. It is not, at this time, definitively not a military problem. I want to preface my testimony by saying how much I respect the service and the sacrifice of Border Patrol agents, Texas Department of Safety troopers, and other law enforcement officers who safeguard our border areas and our communities. My own uniformed service was in the military, not in law enforcement, but I'm a proud member of a 3-generation law enforcement family. And with respect to the Border Patrol, and my dad was serving as a New Hampshire State Trooper who was involved in the apprehension of Carl Draga in 1997 alongside a Border Patrol agent who was shot and wounded during that incident. So we show our military men and women a great deal of appreciation in this country, but not frequently enough with law enforcement and their families. So thank you for everything that you both do and all that you represent. Ensuring that our law enforcement agencies have the resources they need must be a national priority. And there's no question that a secure border is essential. Fortunately, we've been on the right track toward both of those goals over the past several decades. We've tripled the Border Patrol's budget since 2001, even as apprehensions have dropped dramatically from over 1.2 million in 2001 to just over 300,000 in 2017, a large portion of whom were asylum seekers who appeared at ports of entry or actively sought out Border Patrol agents rather than attempting to avoid them. There's much more important work to be done, of course, and it's critical that we do it. But these numbers point to a success story for the nation, and they reflect important political and economic changes in the hemisphere. What these numbers do not point to, and what we do not in fact face, is a true crisis or emergency on the border. We face challenges, of course, but those challenges are best addressed by strengthening the institutions we already have to support safe and orderly migration and through foreign policy and economic statecraft in Latin America, not by using the military. Nonetheless, President Trump frequently speaks of the need for a Great Wall across nearly 5,000 miles of the southern border. He initially claimed this wall would be paid for by the government of Mexico, which of course declined to do so. He then sought the funding from Congress, which has also in large part declined up to this point. So now President Trump has declared his intention to deploy up to 4,000 National Guardsmen to the border, in the President's own words, keep them there, or a large portion of them there, until such time as we build the wall, close quote. There may be some marginal benefit to the deployment, but there are a great many causes for serious concern, all the more so because it does not appear to be the result of a deliberative planning or decision-making process. The decisions likely to negatively impact readiness for the National Guard, potentially for the active duty force as well, do nothing to improve the capabilities or strength of the Border Patrol itself in the long run, and do precious little to improve security. Time does not permit me to lay out all the reasons this is so, which are detailed much more fully in my written testimony, but essentially it comes down to readiness and cost, two issues which are, of course, extremely interrelated. It's still unclear where the funds for this will come from, but costs are likely to be in the hundreds of millions at a minimum. And if that funding is repurposed from within the Department of Defense, Congress should ask hard questions about the impact on other defense priorities, especially readiness. There's also a direct readiness cost to the National Guard, since by definition, guardsmen who are standing tower duty, clearing brush, maintaining fences, doing other things on the border, are not training with their brigade combat teams for their primary mission, which is combat. That impacts our national security as a whole because as an operational reserve, the Guard's an integral part of our military team. If we faced an actual emergency on the border, those costs and risks would perhaps be worth incurring, but consider this so-called threat that prompted this very hearing. A caravan of Central American migrants that presented no serious national security threat to the United States in the first place, and that is now largely dissipated, with only a fraction of the original 1,200 travelers planning to continue their journey northward through Mexico, where, by all indications, they intend to present themselves at a port of entry and seek asylum. So in short, the situation at our southern border is in many ways better than it's been in decades, but meanwhile, the National Guard is an increasingly integral part of our military, and our military faces a more challenging environment around the world than it has in decades. Ongoing wars in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, counterterrorism work in East Africa, West Africa, and Yemen, ongoing commitments to NATO and our mission in Kosovo, which the Guard entirely owns, critical deterrence missions in the Persian Gulf and the Korean Peninsula, where that border is more dangerous than it's been at any point since the last Korean War. Our military is facing all of these challenges just as the services are finally digging out of a serious readiness gap that Secretary Mattis is testifying to down the hall, left by 15 years of war. So this is not the time to pull troops and dollars away from their primary mission to fight and win the nation's wars, especially in the absence of a genuine threat. There is much we can do and should do to improve the situation on our southern border. I hope we do those things. But deploying the National Guard in this manner right now is not one of those things. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Colonel McCraw, when they had the border surge in 2014, was that something that was good or bad for the drug cartels?
It's always good for the cartels if they can overwhelm Border Patrol's resources, and that's what happened in 2014. It overwhelmed the resources, and the threat is more significant than I think that some have led on to. When you're talking about Mexican cartels that are powerful and ruthless and dominate the entire lucrative drug and human smuggling market, they engage in trafficking of people and drug trafficking as well. When you got transnational gangs, when you got criminal aliens, when you have these smuggling communities recruit our children, all of these things, result in a serious public safety threat. And like I said before, not just Texas. What happens on that Texas-Mexico border happens throughout the nation. So clearly, it was a problem. And we saw that. And less Border Patrol agents were there, and they were involved in detention activities and trying, in an overwhelmed situation, trying to deal with unaccompanied children and family units, and could not put enough people in line. In Texas, at that point in time, they decided, the leadership and state legislature decided to spend enough resources to conduct and send troopers around 24/7 from around the state and maintain surge operations for 3.5 years until we can permanently assign troopers down to that area. So from a Texas standpoint, they've been paying the bill thus far, and anything you can do to support Border Patrol, we're all for. If it's National Guard right now, fine, but the long-term solution is clearly invest in Border Patrol. And you get right down to it, the patrol function in the federal government has never been valued, period. The investigative function, yes, but not the patrol function. They don't have the incentive bonuses, they don't have the salary, they don't have the things that are recruiting. They can readily recruit and compete with some of the other services at the federal level. Patrol in a post-9/11 environment is extremely important. It's a deterrent capability. And unless you invest in it, you're not going to have the type of capability that you need. And clearly, again, I've said it on a number of occasions, and not just here, is that Border Patrol can do it. They don't need Texas to help them if they're given the proper resources to do it. And if it's National Guard right now, we're all for it. Anything you can, because we look at it every day matters. Every day a community is impacted in Texas. Every day something goes on that's criminal, that's transnational crime that we have to deal with in Texas. So anything we can do and the federal government can do, we're all for.
Mr. Judd, in terms of the cartels and bringing, because I think we're seeing in our country a huge problem with fentanyl and some of these opioids. These are street drugs. They're being brought in. A lot of it's across the border. A lot of it originates in China. Where is the majority of that coming in terms of, are these controlled access points that they're just sneaking past the guards, or are they parts of the border that are unsecured?
No, most everything that's coming across is coming between the ports of entry because it's easy. If you go through a controlled environment, you've got all kinds of people, you've got the canine handlers, you've got to get past all of that. What it's very easy for the smugglers to do is it's easy for them to send people across the border illegally, which they force them to do. They force us to take our resources out of the field to deal with that, create the gaps, and then they cross their products right behind in the gaps that they created. You got to remember, of those 50,000 apprehensions that we had in March, only 13,000 was at the ports of entry. 38,000 was between the ports of entry.
Mr. Arthur, in terms of asylum, how does it work? If somebody's living in a poor country where there's crime, can they just kind of come here and say asylum, or do they have to qualify for certain types of, maybe they were persecuted on the basis of race or religion or something like that? Can you just give us how is it supposed to work, and then how is it actually working?
To be granted asylum in the United States, you have to show either past persecution or well-founded fear of persecution on the account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. 4 of those are easily defined. The 5th one, Membership in a particular social group, unfortunately, is rather vague in the law and vague in its interpretation. But fortunately, Attorney General Sessions has certified a case to himself in which he will clarify what exactly the parameters are for granting asylum on the basis of being the victim of a criminal activity, such as by gangs in a foreign country.
So, I mean, I think most of us believe that, there is a role for people who are being persecuted. The United States does want to be a refuge for folks in that situation. But if you're coming in because, you want better job opportunities or here using some amorphous thing, I mean, isn't that kind of a runaround just the normal legal immigration process where they should just be applying to come here if they're not actually in any of those buckets that you're talking about?
Unfortunately, it's actually worse than that, because the fact is the bad claims take away from the good claims. They take away from the time that the judges have to grant asylum to individuals who are actually in fear of harm in their home countries. Once granted asylum by an immigration judge, those individuals could then petition to bring their families out of that dangerous situation. But when the system gets clogged up with fraudulent claims or non-meritorious claims, the system breaks down, and that's what we're seeing right now in our immigration courts.
Great. I'm out of time, so I'm going to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, I'd like to have entered into the record a letter from Amnesty International regarding this hearing.
Without objection.
Thank you. As I noted earlier, the omnibus appropriation bill that we just did allocated $14 billion for Customs and Border Protection. That included a lot for security operations and I believe hiring, 351 additional Border Patrol agents. However, that bill did not anticipate moving 4,000 National Guard to the border. That's a separate budget that's got to come off DOD's account. And last week, Secretary of Defense Mattis directed the Pentagon Comptroller to, quote, identify available funding to pay for the 4,000 National Guard troops to be moved to the border. We still don't have an estimate of how much the operation will cost, but we do know it will divert resources from other military priorities. Chairman Mac Thornberry, also a Texas native, had this to say. He said, if you take away money, you can't do some of the things that, you take away things from the money from the defense budget, you can't do some of those things that you were trying to do, like add pilots or repair ships or those other sort of things. Mr. Breen, first of all, thank you for your service to your country. We appreciate it. What do you think about pulling money from, I think, core defense and combat training activities and diverting, 2,000 to 4,000 of our National Guard men and women to the border? What do you think about the efficacy of that move?
Well, Congressman, it's a dangerous game to start playing, and I think history indicates that all the way back to Task Force Smith in the First Korean War. Readiness degrades in a military force very quickly, and the cost of that can be very high when you get yourself into a fight. I agree with a great deal of what Colonel McGraw had to say in the sense that we do need to invest in these capabilities, but I think there's a patrol and other things, but I think there's a great danger when policymakers reach for the military as a Band-Aid to solve problems in other areas of government. And the military can only do so many things. It's been overstretched. The Secretary of Defense, who knows a few things about being in a fight, again is down the hall saying the #1 priority is lethality. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says his readiness is his #1 priority. He has no #2 priority. And he's identified critical readiness needs in terms of the force's ability to go toe-to-toe with foes like Russia and other modernizing militaries. We have become, I think, a little too accustomed to think of ourselves as an overwhelmingly superior force, but we've been tied down doing counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, which is serious tasks. Meanwhile, the world's other high-end militaries have been modernizing and have been looking at everything we do and training and manning and equipping specifically to fight us. So we've got to really catch up to that. And again, going back into history, Task Force Smith was about 5 years after the end of World War II. It doesn't take long. You take the most capable land force the world had ever seen that wanted to beat the Nazis and the Japanese in World War II. 5 years later, puts an infantry force into the field against a second-rate North Korean army and is routed. because the investments weren't continuously made in that combat capability. So I think it's dangerous. The other thing I would say is that it impacts the entire Guard. It sounds like, it's only 4,000 Guardsmen, but the Guard needs to deploy and fight as a brigade combat team. Brigade combat team's 5,000 soldiers. When you start removing elements of that team for other tasks, it degrades the entire team's ability to train. And the National Guard has a modernization and training plan called National Guard 4.0 that explicitly calls for those brigade combat teams to be kept together and trained together so they can deploy to fight together. So this directly undermines those priorities.
Thank you. And by the way, thank you all for your service to our country. Thank you all. We've had a chance, members of this committee, to go down. We went down to Tegucigalpa, down in Honduras. We went down to Guatemala City, down to El Salvador, to look at the human trafficking operations going on there that are actually inducing people to come up to the border. We also have had an active role in what's going on in the tri-border area, where we've got Hezbollah on the ground, and so there are major concerns there. My question is really about the efficiency and efficacy of our funding. Is it better to try to divert money to the National Guard, or, look, I voted for this $14 billion for Border Patrol, enhanced border security. Is that a better way to address the challenge that we have, or should we sort of try to make it up as we go along using our National Guard folks to do a job they necessarily weren't really, they didn't sign up for, I guess?
Well, the investment in the Border Patrol has to be there, but right now you have an attrition rate that exceeds the hiring rate. And so we're not retaining our Border Patrol agents, so we do have to have a stopgap. But as far as our National Guard, they're being put in situations that is like combat situations. They're in LP and OP situations. They're sitting in observation posts, which they would be required to do in the military in the event that a war was to take place. Yeah. As a uniformed officer, I've worked right next to my uniformed National Guard counterparts, and I can tell you that they feel that the operations that they're doing is...
I know my time is running short. All I'm saying is that Secretary Mattis had other stuff for those folks to be doing rather than being sitting on the border. And I'm just worried about those other priorities that are being ignored. But thank you. I appreciate it. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I was growing up, my grandparents in Scott County, Tennessee, one of the poorest counties in the U.S., they had 10 kids and an outhouse and not much more. My dad hitchhiked into Knoxville with $5 in his pocket to go to the university, and all 10 of those children ended up doing real well, but they all grew up in what would be considered bitter poverty today and started with nothing. So I have spoken many times at the naturalization ceremonies in Knoxville to express my respect and admiration for people who come to this country with nothing except a desire to work and who've made good livings for themselves. But the American people are the kindest, most generous people in the world, and we have allowed far more immigration than any other country over the last 50 years or so, than any other country. No other country has come close. But when I Google the question of percentage of world population that lives on $10 a day or less, the first thing that pops up is from some issue, globalissues.org. It says at least 80% of humanity live on less than $10 a day. More than almost half the world, over 3 billion people, live on less than $2.50 a day. And they have similar articles like that. We all have tremendous sympathy for all these people who are living in such bitter poverty around the world. But when you talk about 3 billion people living with almost nothing, you can understand that we have no telling how many people who would come here tomorrow if they possibly could. So it seems to me that we have to have some sort of legal, orderly system of immigration, and it has to be enforced, because if we didn't, our whole infrastructure, our hospitals, our jails, our sewers, our schools, our roads, our whole economy, we couldn't handle such a rapid influx as we might have over the next 3 or 4 years if we just simply opened our borders or didn't enforce our immigration laws. And so when I've heard I'm now in my 30th year in the Congress. Every year since I've been here, I've heard this figure, 11 million immigrants. I believe it has to be at least 2 or 3 times that many that are here, living here illegally, because I'm not near a border, but every place in the country is overrun, it seems to me, with illegal immigrants. I just wonder, it's not being mean or cruel or harsh to say that we have to have some of these immigration laws and they have to be enforced. We have to do it, it seems to me, unless we want to almost destroy this country economically. Mr. Judd, what do you think would happen if we simply, if we did away with the Border Patrol and basically just had no borders, open borders?
Well, just from my experience of people that cross the border illegally now, I think that we would have mass influxes of people coming across the border, but that's just from my experience. I would like to say that I wish that my colleague from management were here to testify as well, because they could specifically tell you what we would, why we're allocating resources where we're allocating them, and if we were allocating them properly, maybe we wouldn't even need the National Guard, but we'll never know that because we didn't do it.
Well, it seems to me that we've got to have stronger enforcement of our immigration laws for many, many reasons, and I think almost all of us, probably everybody at this table, believes in legal immigration and continuing to allow many, many people to immigrate here legally. But we just have a problem that we are forced to do something about. Colonel McGraw, you want to say anything? Or Mr. Arthur?
I'll gladly pitch in just a couple comments. Well, first, we've had a very good relationship with the U.S. Border Patrol. I think that's important that we state that. And the leadership has worked very well with us along the border. And there's a seamless operation. We know what Unified Command is about. We understand in terms of why important of integrating in terms of air, marine, and land operations, special operations groups. All of those things are happening. And some things that we can do is use some of our special agents to target the smuggling infrastructure in some of those areas. So I want to give a clear indication to you and members that we do work very well with our federal partners, and we're very proud to work with them. The U.S. Border Patrol, the brave men and women, all they risk their lives daily to protect Texas and the rest of this nation. So I just want to get that on the record. In terms of our concerns, is this simply put, is that if the border is not secured, then you're opening it up to increase drugs, criminal aliens, transnational gangs, some of the things you're already seeing, because the border is not secure. And there's no question that it has an impact on public safety in Texas. Anybody will tell you that. Texas sheriffs will tell you that. Border sheriffs will tell you that. This is a nonpartisan issue. This is a national security and public safety threat. This is nothing about politics, just simply is. And in terms of where the funding comes from, way above my pay grade. How it happens, how Border Patrol gets the resources they need to secure it between the ports of entry. That's certainly above my pay grade. I'm sure you can figure it out if you wanted to. And believe me, I can assure you from my discussions with members, and I've got appropriations hearing next week in Texas, is they want to find out in terms of where we are staffing at a federal level so we can back off from the state standpoint. But right now, when the governor's made it very clear, we're not going to back off an inch. We're not going to give 1 inch to the cartels and the transnational gangs to support them.
Well, I certainly agree with you, but my time's up. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses who showed up for showing up. I really appreciate that. I believe it is quite evident that the recent deployment of National Guard troops to the southern border is hardly the result of carefully considered fact-based decisions. On April 1st, President Trump manufactured a crisis on Twitter and justified the deployment of national troops after watching Fox News describe a caravan of Central American migrants who entered the U.S. through the so-called catch and release. And as with a lot of his tweets, there's plenty of misinformation to unpack. First, he appears to be claiming it is getting more dangerous due to a caravan of largely Honduran asylum seekers fleeing violence, mostly who are women and children, even babies. Mr. Breen, is this also your understanding?
Yeah, my understanding is that the Caravan is essentially asylum seekers fleeing an extremely violent northern triangle of Central America, yes.
Do you believe this caravan of asylum seekers poses a national security or military threat?
I have absolutely no reason to believe that, no.
And I know I'm asking you to restate some of your points, but it's for a purpose. President Trump also seemed to imply that the caravans were coming in part because of DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. Among other conditions, only individuals who have lived here in the U.S. since 2007 would be eligible. Mr. Breen, with that in mind, would it be possible for any new arrival from a caravan to be eligible for DACA?
And by definition, no, it would not.
President Trump's decision to send National Guard troops to the border until a 2,000-mile wall is built is also baffling from a policy perspective. Mr. Breen, is constructing a 2,000-mile concrete border wall the most efficient or effective way to improve border security?
I do not believe so, no. The wall would, I mean, basically every expert who looked at this, you can construct a physical fortification at great cost that will take a great period of time. You're going to have to use eminent domain a lot to do that, run through a lot of private property, major challenges there. And then in the absence of the kind of patrol and interdiction resources Colonel McGraw is talking about, all you're going to have is an expensive wall people get over, to say nothing of the fact that as border apprehensions have been decreasing, the Coast Guard's interdictions in counter-drug at sea have been increasing this entire time. So I think there are a lot of other places you can put the $20 billion or whatever it's going to cost, from increasing, added capacity for immigration courts to better resources for Border Patrol to resourcing the Coast Guard adequately, and on we go. But no, I don't think the wall is an effective solution.
Also, Mattis signed a memo that stated that the National Guard will not perform law enforcement activities or interact with migrants. Mr. Breen, is that right? And what would the National Guard's role consist of, and how effective would they be?
I think that's correct. That is definitely the right thing to do. It's worth noting that this is a Title 32 situation, not a Title 10 situation. So Secretary Mattis is not in a position, as strange as it may sound, to directly issue guidance to the Guard. That falls to the governors. But I definitely think that is the wisest course of action. What ends up happening, of course, is that in theory, the National Guard will do things like man towers and do other tasks so that Border Patrol agents are free to go out. But as Mr. Judd has already stated, Border Patrol's already got, in some situations, 75% of its man strength not patrolling already. So it's a little hard to see in a management situation like that how you're not just going to have a lot of guys, frankly, just standing around.
So I don't have much time. So one of the things I want to kind of point out and ask, because it was justified the deployment of National Guard troops based on catch and release in DACA. Does sending National Guard troops to the border change any policy that you know of, catch and release or DACA?
No, not at all.
So my point is that it seems that this policy was decided at a whim to send National Guard down to the border. I'm not saying that it won't be necessary, but I like to have something that's actually fact-based, something that is thought out, that's done with coordination, and understands that there is a real crisis going on the border. And if your justification is the drug cartels, state it. Don't make up another fact that just kind of gives red meat to your base, right? That's what this president did, is using something that's not correlated with what he's calling a crisis, because there's no crisis because of these asylum seekers, right? So, and it doesn't change policy at all. All you're doing is sending more troops to the border that are going to probably not produce the result of keeping away people who will be catch and release or DACA recipients. So I just appreciate the time. In closing, I'd like to enter a letter from civil rights groups in California asking Governor Brown to reject the xenophobia driving the deployment of the National Guard to our border.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCraw, I understand that your department is responsible in Texas for maintaining the statewide sex offender registry. Is that correct? Okay. This is a little off topic, I understand, but it's a great concern to me, the threat that's been posed by convicted sex offenders who have entered this country illegally. And under the previous administration, many of those individuals were released from ICE custody without even local law enforcement being notified and without ensuring that they were placed on the National Sex Offender Registry. I realize a lot has been done within ICE over the last couple of years in the law enforcement notification system. Progress is being made. I understand that. I deeply appreciate that. But I'm likewise very much concerned that we've still got a long ways to go with this. So it's my understanding, for example, that when ICE enforcement and removal operations is scheduled to release an illegal alien who is required supposedly to register on the sex offender list, that ICE sends notification through the Department of Justice SORNA, the exchange portal. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So when you receive this information, what kind of information is provided? What do you get from ICE? For example, are you getting criminal histories, country of origin, fingerprints, aliases? What do you get?
We're getting all the information that we need to be able to follow state law and follow up and also the federal requirements, so we can get them registered at that point in time. In fact, with the ICE ERO, we've actually done some operations with them to capture sex offenders that were criminal aliens here in Texas that had been registered and had them deported.
But are you getting like fingerprints, and do you get?
Yes, sir. And I have no reason to know otherwise. If there's anything contrary to that, I'll get back to you. But as I understand it right now, we're getting all that we need from ICE ERO on the situation like that.
All right, I'm glad to hear that. But if you would get back with me on what you do receive, I
yes,
would like that. All right, so at this point in the process, is it then your department or ICE that has the responsibility to ensure that local law enforcement knows about these individuals?
Well, we certainly do. We go through the process. Once they get registered in the Texas registry, and because they live in Texas at that point, we notify local agencies at that point in time. And they have the responsibility to register them.
So ICE hands the baton to you, and at this point, it's your responsibility.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and Texas is doing a good job with notifying law enforcement locally and so forth. It's my understanding a lot of states are dropping the ball on that. Are you aware of that?
Well, I'm not aware of what they're doing in other states. I just know that the governor and legislature won't stand for anything less than getting it done correctly.
Okay, it's my understanding that local law enforcement is unable, and certainly citizens likewise, but local law enforcement is unable to access the DOJ SORNA exchange portal. Is that?
I'm not aware of that. I know that they can access the Texas sex offender registry. I know they have access to that. I can't tell you from the SORNA from a federal standpoint.
Okay, so that's where it becomes your responsibility to make sure they get
yes,
it.
Sir.
Because they're not able to, as I understand it, and I would just want to make sure. So how can we better fix this whole process, improve the notification, the information sharing process, and this type of thing when it comes to sex offenders?
Well, again, you're looking at different states, done different things, and some of those things are laws, and some things have taken a more proactive approach to that concern. In Texas, the legislation and governor have been very proactive and concerned about sex trafficking, whether it's international sex trafficking or we're seeing domestic sex trafficking by gangs, and they've been very proactive in that area.
Okay. Well, listen, I want to thank you for your work with this, and I wanted to, like I said, I know this is a little off topic, but it's still very much related to the overall topic because we're dealing with this stuff on a regular basis, and I appreciate your expertise and what you do. I just want to make it known I'm willing to work and look forward to working with you, your department, any of you who are interested in helping find ways to close the gaps and ensure the safety of the American public in this regard. And I appreciate your work in that regard.
Well, sex trafficking is a problem. And it clearly is. So we'll get back to you if we have anything.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank the witnesses again for appearing before us today. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. If there's no further business, without objection, the Subcommittee on National Security stands adjourned.